Welcome to Saturday's session and the last of our series of 4 on Christmas, which I've called Magi Musings. The plan was that we'd follow the theme from, to quote the book of Luke, that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. We will pick up on that. The focus has really become the marvel of the Magi. So just briefly what happens in the story that we're looking at this week. Well, we're looking at Matthew chapter 2 and the visit of the Magi to see the baby Jesus. And basically, as we pick up in chapter 2, we discover that the Magi have seen the star of the one born to be King of the Jews. They've seen that in the east, and they travel through to the obvious place to go to for a King of the Jews, and that's Jerusalem. And they see Herod, King Herod, who is incidentally is not a Jew, or at least I think he's only half Jewish or something. But he gets a little disturbed, and as Matthew ironically puts it, with all Jerusalem with him. King Herod, this is Herod the Great, the first of a number of Herods, and he's something of a homicidal maniac. He's murdered his wife, he's murdered 2 or 3 of his sons and his uncle already. He is a sick man, both in body and in mind, I suspect. But he's a very vicious ruler. So they reach King Herod, and he consults the priests and so on, and they say, the Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem, because that's what it says in the Old Testament. So Herod sends off the wise men, and they go off to Bethlehem, and Herod says, when you've seen him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. Yeah, right. So the wise men find the baby Jesus, and they give their gifts, gold, frankincense and myrrh, and then they are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, and they go back by another route, avoiding Jerusalem. Okay, so that's the story, and the first thing that I notice that I have this study Bible with a commentary underneath the text of the Bible. So it points out that Matthew says that Jesus is a child, not a baby, and that the wise men visit him in a house, not a stable. So clearly this is months after the events of Christmas. Is that actually correct? So let's do a quick fact check on this. Bear in mind that I know this commentary is in my Bible, but that doesn't mean to say it's necessarily correct. I have actually believed that for some years, but then I did a fact check and realised there's a bit more to it than that. So first of all, let's look at the fact that Matthew does indeed use the term child about Jesus rather than baby. But then if we turn more forward to the Gospel of Luke, we find that Luke also uses the term child, and he uses it interchangeably with the term baby. So he says in effect that the shepherds say, let's go and see this baby that God has told us about, and then they go out and tell everyone about the child. So the two terms are used interchangeably, and particularly with Luke, who is the university-trained physician, he's quite precise about his use of words. And the second thing is where Matthew says about the wise men visiting Jesus in a house, whereas Luke says he was born in a stable. Luke does not say Jesus was born in a stable. It does say that he wasn't born in the inn, so they'd obviously only just got to Bethlehem and hadn't had time to find somewhere to live, and there wasn't space in the inn, which is where one might expect to go. It does say that Jesus was laid in a manger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the manger was in a stable. I identified about 4 possibilities there. So, yeah, for sure, the manger, the animal feeding trough, could have been in a stable, and it could have been attached to the inn, for example. That's one of the interpretations that we see often on Christmas cards and so on. There is another tradition that goes back a long way in the history of the Middle East, in that visitors sometimes came and camped out under the stars, as it were, in the market square in a town when they were travelling. And some market squares might, for example, have provided, well, even today we can find villages in the Cotswolds, for example, where there's a drinking trough, and there might have been a feeding trough as well, provided in the market square for travellers. That's possible. There was an early tradition that says that the manger was actually in a cave, used as a stable, fair dues, but it was actually in a cave, and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem is built over the cave that is supposed to be the place where Jesus was born. And a fourth possibility, it's good to remember that, again, a tradition stretching back a few thousand years actually, and going on forward into Viking times, well past the time of Jesus, there was a tradition that families would live in a single-roomed house with a bed in one corner for the family bed, maybe a fire in the centre of the house for cooking and heating on cold nights, and in another corner might be a penned-in area for family livestock, which indeed might have a manger. And we thought about that just before Christmas. Just bear in mind that Joseph and Mary have come back to their hometown of Bethlehem. Surely they would have had relatives there if it's their hometown. If they've got relatives there, with Middle Eastern hospitality expectations, I would be surprised if you like, Uncle Ben could stand the shame of allowing Mary and Joseph to be out in the market square overnight, especially when Mary's just had a baby. Wouldn't his family have put him up? And so maybe he could have been laid in a manger in the family home. Possibly. It's all just conjecture. Let's ask the question, who were the Magi? So were they three kings? Were they three wise men? Well, we don't even know there were three. And it doesn't say they were kings. It doesn't actually say they were wise men. It says they were Magi. We usually use a term like Magi when we're too embarrassed to use the obvious meaning of the word. And the obvious meaning of the word is magician. And it is used elsewhere in the Bible, and it is used as people who are magicians, who use magic and sorcery. We need to get the context though, because it's not magicians it's not witches in quite the same sense that we might think of although they might well be into spells and putting curses on people. There's an example of that in the Old Testament with Balaam. You can look that up sometime if you want. They're not magicians in the sense of, depending on which generation you are, David Nixon, Daniels, or David Blaine or whoever, not someone pulling tricks, though some of them did pull tricks. There was a long history of folk who would basically be called magicians who acted as royal advisors. You can see that in Egypt when Moses was bringing the people out of Egypt. The magicians were the ones who advised Pharaoh when Moses went to see Pharaoh. Daniel and his friends in the time of the captivity in Babylon, which is where these wise men might have come from, was trained in the Babylonian learning, which included being trained like a magician, which is why he was very keen to make a real stand for his faith as a Jew in the God of Israel. So these Magi probably were astrologers, reading the stars, reading meaning into it. Astronomers, because you've got to know how stars move in order to be good at that job. They would offer advice. They might be royal advisors. They were presumably rich. Their gifts were incredibly expensive. They knew something about the Jews and their promised king. So they were coming to Jerusalem as the place where they would expect to see the promised king for Israel being born. And the gifts they brought were interesting. They brought gold for a king, frankincense that's incense, as in incense that you burn in churches, so frankincense for a priest, and myrrh was like balm, a soothing ointment for someone who was going to suffer. So one can't help but think, if they did come from Babylon, where they did have a tradition of royal magician advisors, they also had the Jews come into their culture about 600 years before this, and they might even have known about the book of Isaiah and Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant and everything. So that's all possible. So I'm sticking with the idea that they might have come from Babylon. If they did, the distance was about just over 500 miles direct. but the likelihood apparently is that they would have gone the longer route along the Euphrates River, which might have been at least 800 miles. With the direct route, I thought that was possible in 10 days if they were in a hurry. That would mean that they could arrive 12 days after the birth of Jesus if they left when Jesus was born. But apparently 40 to 50 days is more likely. From Jerusalem to Bethlehem, once they've got to Jerusalem, Bethlehem is only 5 to 6 miles away, so even if you walk slowly, that's sort of 2 to 3 hours maximum. So when might the Magi have arrived in Bethlehem? Well, so if the Magi saw this astral event, whatever it was, coming, and could work out when it was going to be there, then surely wouldn't you think, for something that would be as amazing as this, not a once in a lifetime event, but a once in history event, then I think I'd be tempted to set out early, taking into account the length of time that I know the journey will take, so I get there as it happens. So if that were true, then there's no reason why they couldn't have been there on the night it happened with the shepherds. So maybe it's not so wrong as we thought, that you have the shepherds and the wise men together in at the manger with the baby Jesus. Some Christian traditions have the Magi arriving just a few days later, some on the 28th of December, some on the 29th of December. Some Christian traditions have the Magi arriving on the 12th day of Christmas, that's January the 5th. Or it could be that they didn't set out until the event actually happened, in which case they might have arrived nearly 2 months later, 40 to 50 days or whatever, however long it took to travel there. So the important thing is that all options are on the table. We can't seem to be able to exclude any of them. So let's just think about this. Maybe it doesn't really matter when the Magi arrived. It doesn't actually matter where Jesus was when they arrived, whether he was in a stable or a house or a cave or whatever. The important thing to remember is that the Magi were not Jews. They came from a distant culture, and yet they made a long, difficult and dangerous journey. They were carrying expensive and meaningful gifts, and they did that in order to worship a Jewish baby whom they recognised as king, priest and saviour, should we say, the one who's going to be sacrificed for his people's sins. And just to round that off, on one occasion Jesus said to the people who were listening to him, "The Queen of the South came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon, and one greater than Solomon is here." So maybe we could add that the wise men of the East came from the ends of the earth to worship Jesus at his birth. So how much does Jesus mean to me? Thank you for listening. May I wish you a happy new year, and may 2021 be much better than 2020 has been with all the COVID nonsense going on.